Now 2 weeks since the Labour Party trounced the Conservatives in the Selby and Ainsty by-election and yet failed to oust the governing party in the outer London seat of Uxbridge. And while Sir Keir Starmer's side is still wrestling with the implications of that failure, Rishi Suna is letting the public know that he's received the message. He's come out against what he calls anti-motorist policies like the ultra-low emissions zone. And he's given the go-ahead for more drilling for offshore oil and gas. It has raised the hackles of Greenpeace, who invaded the Prime Minister's Yorkshire home in protest. But how will it play out amongst the rest of the voting public? I'm joined by Michelle Chisholm, who's a care worker in Outer London and, as of recently, an Anti-ULEZ campaigner, Alistair Donald from the Academy of Ideas, and Paul Richards, author and a former Labour special advisor. Michelle, what brought you into political activity? Because you're not a particularly political person, are you?
I'll be honest, Michael, I've never, ever voted, but I didn't actually realise I was getting into politics. My father is 76 years old. He's a builder. He's still working. He's been going on for the last probably 18 months about ULEZ and the cost. My mother is a part-time worker. She is also semi-retired and drives a diesel vehicle. Again, my father's been going on and on and on. So I started investigating and researching and discovered that it would cost both of those £12.50 per day to go to work. Now, they're at retirement age, they're older part of life, and for both of them, it's just not practical to be buying new vehicles. I then got involved in trying to find out where protests and things like that were happening and stumbled across a Facebook group called Action Against ULEZ Extension, which has 35,000 members and a sister group that has 45,000 members. I started reading and researching, and the horror stories that I'm reading from the public are just frightening. It's heartbreaking. The
horror stories like those you've already told us, are people who are risking going out of business because of this charge.
There are so many companies going out of business, sole traders particularly, the elderly becoming prisoners at home. We have people that are quite frankly suicidal. People have been writing to the Mayor's office and have had replies telling them that they should contact Mind. And I just find it really frightening that the Mayor is not listening to the public. I'm grateful that finally Rishi Suna has come out and said that he will, he's not anti-motorist, but to be honest, it is day on attack on the motorist. And I just think that nobody's taking the people into consideration here. I really support our elderly and our vulnerable, our disabled. And it's just frightening that you get to the later part of your life and you're being told that basically you need to stay at home or pay £12.50 every day. And I find that really, really frightening. We're in a cost of living crisis. We have food banks in our boroughs. Electricity, gas is all going up. People can't afford to eat. Now, Sadiq Khan is offering to feed children every day free school dinners, but it's in one hand you're taking £12.50 and then in another hand you're feeding the children. Well, why not let the parents keep their own £12.50 and feed their own children?
Michelle, thank you very much. There's a danger here, of course, Alistair, of confusing topics, because ULEZ is basically about pollution and supposedly, protecting the health, particularly of children. But nonetheless, we are also now into this debate. May I just ask you to position you? On this programme, we talked to Ross Clark about his book, Not Zero, which basically predicts that net zero is going to be a catastrophe for this country and a great advantage to places like China. Does that summarise your position? Are you against net zero, at least in the timescale that the government wants to do it?
Yeah, I think I am. Net zero is already a disaster in some ways for this country, because even although it's projected into the future and the date of 2050 is the one that people talk about, the policies that are being implemented are much sooner than that. I mean, we're due to switch over to away from diesel and petrol in 2030, and there's other measures that are coming in even next year. So the consequences of these things have come forward and they're hitting us now, which is one of the reasons why the ULEZ in Outer London has has become such a bone of contention, because it's created a situation where it's not in the future, but it's very much now, and it's hitting people in the pocket, which I think is unusual. You almost think, what was Sadiq doing when he did this? Because it's quite clever the way that these policies have been introduced in the past, because often they've been at the level of subsidies. You hand out subsidies for insulation, or you hand out subsidies for solar panels or whatever. So it seems to be in some ways a benefit for people. But what the ULEZ situation has exposed is that not only is it not a benefit, but it actually targets normal working people and makes life more difficult for them.
Is it your assessment, first of all, that Rishi Suna has changed his position, and secondly, that if he has, and if he changes it more, that it could be of electoral advantage? What's your assessment?
Well, I think he has changed his position to some extent. So he's looking at pushing some of these measures back, or potentially pushing some of them back. So that indicates to me that the consensus around this issue has been to some extent broken, because it was almost an unchallengeable assumption over the past few years that this must be done. I mean, even if you question it, you were called things like a climate denier. You're sort of delegitimized from even questioning this. So I think the political situation is interesting just now because it's placed on the political agenda. What my fear is, though, is that this will become a case of muddling through. It'll be a little bit of delay and a little bit of extra subsidy to sweeten the blow, but it won't actually challenge the bigger issue of net zero and its damaging consequences for the way that economies and the whole of society works. Because ultimately what net zero represents is an anti-development stance. And you can see that. I mean, if you look at the Times this morning, for example, there's an interesting report from Charlotte Evers on the way that this is hitting Wales, where roads are not going to be built because anything that creates more car use or faster speeds is to be banned. I mean, we need to create a society that works, that is more mobile and has the level of economic development that can benefit for people's working lives.
Paul, if Rishi were opening up clear blue water with Labour, would Labour be happy about that, or would it be nervous?
Well, Alok Sharma has said very recently, the Conservatives' green guru, that it's time to wake up and smell the coffee. His reading of the elections was that voters were coming to Labour and away from the Conservatives because the Conservatives were not doing enough on the green agenda. David Cameron, you'll recall, won an election, a majority, with a very green-tinged Conservative agenda. And it's a bit surreal to be sort of trying to row back from these things at a time when Europe is in flames and we've got strange weather patterns dominating our own country and people's holidays have been ruined because of the weather caused by man-made climate change. So, the question should be, how do we make this work? ULEZ is a good example, by the way, of a policy that needs to be finessed, because if it isn't working, you change it, but you don't drop it and just let the air quality get worse and worse and worse. Everyone has to come, people of good faith, together now and try and fix this problem.
What do you think the opinion research shows? If the Conservatives did look less keen on net zero than Labour, how do you think that would play out? I mean, I understand your own position and how you feel about it, but how do you think the numbers would actually look?
Well, that is Sunak's calculus, isn't it? And I assume that they've done a lot of research and I assume they've done some focus groups. But there is a role for leadership here. And what we know from public policy is that if leaders stand up and set a clear direction, they can take people with them. I was very involved in the smoking ban, which at the time people said, you can't do this. There aren't enough police to arrest all the smokers in pubs. And public behaviour and attitude changed almost overnight. Nobody now wants to walk, very few people want to walk into a pub and it would be filled with smoke. The Conservatives' Clean Air Act in the 50s was resisted by business. They said this would be a restriction of trade, it would be bad for the economy. It was introduced by a foresighted Conservative government and the Clean Air Act meant that there was clean air in London. So all of these public policy issues have to be done in a way with some leadership, yes, taking people with them, but you don't drop them at the first sign of trouble. You have to get the job done.
Alistair, the points that Paul has made there, I mean, it strikes me, I'm sorry not to give you a chance to reply at the moment, Paul, it strikes me that, changing the rules on drinking and driving and even smoke-free zones and so on did not involve people in enormous capital cost, which many of these net zero policies do. If we're going to have to change our boilers and our cars and so on. Is that an important difference? Or do you think Paul is right, that with leadership you can persuade people?
Well, I think it's right. This is what people are starting to realise, especially initially through the ULEZ in Outer London. But with all these swathes of measures that are coming up over the next 5-6 years, where we will be forced to change, where there's not really an appetite, all the or lots of the measures that are seem to be slowly coming on the horizon, things like heat pumps and different types of boilers and electric vehicles as well. There's not been the take-up for those options that the government imagines. So they're way behind implementing these things. And it's undoubtedly the case that part of that is because the costs of these things are enormous.
Alistair, we're just coming to the end, and I would just like to give Michelle one last word. I think you may have mentioned that you're not even someone who has a fixed voting pattern.
No.
Is your vote available for the person who gets it right on issues like ULEZ?
I honestly believe my big problem here is that whilst we try to speak to the government about ULEZ, the constant replies when people are emailing, contacting, is that the position sits with the Mayor of London. Now, the Mayor being a Labour Mayor, I think is putting an awful lot of people off of voting for Labour, to be perfectly frank. However, many people are saying that they don't trust Conservatives because they think that Conservatives are hiding behind the Mayor's policy and that the Conservatives actually do want the ULEZ. So, for me personally, I think that the Mayor of London should actually be impartial. We should have some, so because what happens here, the Mayor is basically either at war with mainstream government or is in agreement with mainstream government. If we had an impartial person, I think that would make things much easier. But just before we go, Michael, air pollution, can I say something?
That much, because we've got to go.
OK. Just for the record, it has been confirmed that one person has died from air pollution, not 4,000, as that keeps being cited. And I truly believe that the air pollution that we're being constantly drummed in, bad air pollution,
Overstated, you think?
Yeah, is scaremongering.
Thank you to all. Thank you to Michelle Chisholm, Alistair Donald and Paul Richards.